This is a supersized sperm from Mars. Humans extracted it from Martian soil and cultured it in space. Named Calvin. This Martian organism's cells each contain muscle, nerves, and photosensitive systems. Calvin can grow rapidly in an oxygen environment higher than that of Mars, exciting all astronauts as this was humanity's first discovery of extraterrestrial life. However, the excitement soon turned to fear. Derry, the only biologist on the space station, who is disabled, couldn't suppress his joy at seeing such a unique cellular organism. Calvin's existence potentially meant the regeneration of stem cells, so whenever he had time, Derry would go to the lab module to observe Calvin, but this obsession brought disaster. On the 25th day of research, the lab module suddenly issued an alarm. Mechanic Rory was the first to enter for repairs, luckily finding it a false alarm. After exiting, both blamed Derry for his fatigued operation, which almost caused a major accident. Miranda warned Derry that this was the first and last time, rightly so, as they wouldn't have another chance to make such a mistake. Because of this incident, Calvin went into hibernation. To wake it, Derry prepared to stimulate the cells with electric shocks, and after several attempts, Calvin responded. Calvin used many tentacles to suction onto the chassis, wrapping its entire body around Derry's arm, preventing him from pulling his arm out. As Calvin's grip tightened, Derry's heartbeat increased rapidly, and his pain intensified. Other crew members watched anxiously, wanting to help, but Miranda directly refused, arguing that if something went wrong, at least Calvin would still be isolated inside. At this time, Derry tried to distract Calvin by picking up a broken electric shock baton with his other hand, but Calvin had already lost interest in the baton. Next, Calvin began to exert force, constricting like a python encircling its prey, leaving Derry nothing to do but scream in despair. As Calvin continued to exert force, the sound of bones cracking followed. Seeing such a grim scene, the team outside panicked. By the time Derry passed out from pain, his right hand had turned into a lifeless mass. But that was not the end. Calvin reversed out of the glove, found no exit, returned to the lab to fetch the shock baton, and forcefully snapped it into two pieces. Using the sharp end, Calvin returned to the glove, unexpectedly punctured it, and quickly escaped, eluding the crew's sight. Within less than a minute, Calvin had entered the lab where the white mice were kept. Seeing a live specimen, Calvin could hardly suppress its feeding instinct. It wrapped around a white mouse, digesting and absorbing it. At this moment, Rory, acting independently, opened the door to move the unconscious Derry out, but Calvin did not give him a chance. The moment Derry was moved, Rory's foot was entangled by Calvin. Fortunately, Rory could still resist. He grabbed an oxygen candle and pressed it against it. The high heat successfully made Calvin flee. Rory, wanting to take this opportunity to kill Calvin, got approval and removed the burner. However, Calvin was very agile, dodging the flames and not showing any signs of injury, while Rory's fuel dwindled. Risking opening the cabinet to find more, Calvin jumped into his mouth and entered his body. Everyone knew what this meant. This lab module had to become a sealed isolation chamber. Rory slowly fell, his organs being consumed, blood surging uncontrollably from his mouth, unable to even scream, dying in a floating pool of blood. The rest of the crew felt utterly helpless and despairing. While Rory's body continued to ooze blood, the burner still floated behind, moving with the sensor's detection of heat, prompting the commander and show to rush to the control room. At that time, the well-fed Calvin emerged from Rory's body, having grown several times larger. It could sense gas flow and to prevent it from escaping. Show and the commander were rapidly trying to manually shut off the fire extinguisher. Seeing the fire extinguishing device being shut off, Calvin quickly ran to the next one. After each one was turned off, it continued to follow the airflow trying to escape. Although the commander had increased the speed of shutting them off, the last fire extinguisher was not closed in time, letting Calvin in. This left everyone in shock. Facing such a brutal alien creature, they were merely food on a plate. After dealing with Rory's body, the crew attempted to call Earth's control center, only to find the communications equipment was damaged. To repair the transmitter, the commander, wearing a spacesuit, went outside the space station, prepared to manually fix it. The Earth was stunningly beautiful from space, but the space station was in a perilous state amidst the darkness. The commander quickly reached the equipment and found that the overheating of the cooling system had caused the malfunction. Following Show's guidance, the commander opened the valve of the coolant pipe only to discover it had dried up. They speculated that Calvin had consumed the coolant. Just then, Calvin suddenly charged out, and the commander, unable to make reckless moves, hoped his spacesuit was thick enough to protect him. While moving slowly back towards the cabin, water droplets floated inside his helmet. The coolant pipe had been squeezed by Calvin. Sho informed the commander that the distance was short enough that the cooling system's failure was manageable. However, the focus wasn't on whether the system could cool but on the fact that the commander might drown from the unreleased liquids. To save time, the commander opened the safety catch and leaped toward the safety chamber. Although he securely grabbed onto the space station, the liquid inside his helmet had already occupied nearly half the space. David quickly suited up, allowing Sho to drain the air, preparing to meet the commander inside. But unexpectedly, by this time, the commander had already inhaled liquid into his trachea. In a fierce struggle, she managed to turn the airlock's handle, but this also meant one thing: if the commander returned to the space station, Calvin would follow her back. Thus, in the last moments, the commander changed her mind, started turning the handle in the opposite direction, and locked the airlock securely just as she lost her vital signs. With 2 crew members lost, the remaining ones were on the edge of breakdown. The commander's sacrifice was not the end. Calvin's intelligence had everyone terrified. Sho quickly discovered that it was trying to enter the space station through the air vents. Observing the changes on the dial, Sho immediately activated the jets to eject Calvin out of the air vent. But this method was only a temporary fix, and the irregular jetting had put the space station into a decaying orbit. Soon, the space station would crash towards Earth. For this reason, Sho had to use the last of their fuel to push the space station back into a near-Earth orbit. But this also meant that Calvin would inevitably re-enter the space station. At this point, Derry had a realization: on Mars, Calvin had been in a dormant state due to lack of oxygen. Thus, the crew started to modify the space station urgently, by sealing all air vents, and then everyone retreating into individual sleep pods to breathe their own air. The exposed Calvin would gradually lose vital signs. Draining all the oxygen from the space station would take 4 hours, during which everyone could only pray not to be found by Calvin. From the beginning, Derry had shown signs of exhaustion, and once Miranda and others noticed something was off, Derry could only mutter an apology before passing out. The trio quickly secured Derry's position, and then David pulled out a defibrillator to start resuscitation, managing to get a heartbeat after several attempts. At this moment, Miranda noticed movement in Derry's trouser leg, and upon opening it, was nearly scared out of her wits. Calvin had been feasting on Derry's leg all along, clearly something Derry had been hiding. Miranda attacked with the defibrillator, but it was useless. By then, Calvin had grown into its mature form. While Sho was still in shock, David and Miranda had already started to flee. The 3 were forced to rush through the space station, not bothering with anything else. With David quickly closing the airlock behind them, Sho was cornered in a sleep pod, facing Calvin head-on as it appeared before him. Calvin looked around, its eyes fixated on its prey, and its tentacles clung to the airlock door, starting to exert force, causing the door to gradually crack. Unexpectedly, Calvin suddenly gave up and drifted away. Meanwhile, David and Miranda turned back to find Derry, only to discover he was beyond saving. Watching another crew member die, Miranda was in extreme pain, but it was not the time for grief. Returning to the control room, Miranda suddenly noticed a moving red dot on the station's monitor. It was Calvin, which had inadvertently swallowed a tracker while devouring Derry, now following the trail of blood droplets quickly moving toward Derry. With no fresh food available, it seemed to settle for a corpse instead. Just then, the space station issued a warning of an approaching object. David thought it was an Earth rescue team, but the harsh reality was different. Miranda explained that it was the firewall plan. Once an extraterrestrial organism displayed uncontrollable aggression, Earth would push the space station into deep space. Due to the impact, Sho's sleep pod had cracked. Unwilling to sit and wait for death, Sho risked opening the airlock to move. However, he was unaware of the firewall plan and assumed the colliding ship was there to rescue them, leading to predictable results. When David and Miranda arrived, Sho had already become food for Calvin. The 2 tried to retrieve Sho, but Calvin climbed up his body and, in desperation, Sho grabbed its head, sacrificing his chance for survival to stop it. Miranda and David didn't have time to hesitate. They quickly retreated, managing to lock Calvin outside the airlock in the final moments. However, by then, the space station was already severely damaged. Facing the irreversible destruction of the space station, if sacrificing the entire crew to send Calvin into deep space was the best outcome, it was considered. But David was horrified to discover that the space station wasn't heading into deep space but was accelerating towards the Earth's atmosphere instead. With little time left to save Earth, only one option remained: Miranda would take an escape pod back to Earth, while David would lead Calvin into another escape pod to head into deep space. With the plan decided, David, armed with an oxygen candle, began searching for Calvin while Miranda waited nearby for the signal. Soon, David found Calvin near a body. Quickly snatching the oxygen candle from him, Watching Calvin consume the first candle, David hurriedly set down the second one. Then, with the third, got into the escape pod. From a distance, Miranda saw the signal and swiftly moved towards it. Just as David had suited up, Calvin pounced on his face, carefully holding his breath. David managed to grab the oxygen candle. Taking advantage of Calvin's greed, he quickly closed the pod door, securing Miranda, who hesitated but followed him into her escape pod. David, with Calvin in tow, was the first to detach, followed by Miranda's successful separation. David then adjusted his course to head into deep space. Originally, both escape pods were meant to head in opposite directions as planned. However, an accident occurred during launch. David's pod collided with debris from the space station, causing system malfunctions and veering off course. What was supposed to head towards deep space, carrying Miranda, veered off into deep space, leaving her to an uncertain fate in the vast darkness. Conversely, David's pod, which was supposed to take Calvin into deep space, was now heading towards Earth. Unbeknownst to the humans, Calvin had already deciphered their plan and manipulated the situation to ensure the pod carrying it was directed towards Earth. After several evolutions from consuming life forms, Calvin manipulated the escape pod through Earth's atmosphere, emerging like a fiery meteor, landing safely in the waters off Vietnam. Nearby fishermen, seeing the pod, approached to investigate. David, screaming hoarsely, warned them not to open the hatch. However, the fisherman, not understanding English and thinking he was asking for help, opened the hatch without hesitation.